I ought to say, that, just to put this in its context, because we've got rather a long reading tonight and we're going to have to truncate it slightly, that this is the occasion when David was going into exile. Absalom, that rogue scoundrel of a son, has usurped the throne of David, and David is running for his life. And as he leaves Jerusalem, crosses over the Kidron and makes his way across up the Mount of Olives and out to the wilderness, that's where we break into the story. 2 Samuel 15. We read from verse 24. There was Zadok also, and also the Levites with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had finished crossing over from the city. Then the king said to Zadok, carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. But if he says thus, I have no delight in you, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to him. The king also said to Zadok the priest, are you not a seer? Return to the city in peace, you and your 2 sons with you. Ahimaaz, your son, and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar. See, I will wait in the plains of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. Therefore, Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, wept as he went up. He had his head covered as he went barefoot, and all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up, weeping as they went up. Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now it happened when David had come to the top of the mountain where he worshipped God, there was Hushai, the Archite, coming to meet him, with his robe torn and dust on his head. And David said to him, if you go on with me, then you will become a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I was your father's servant previously, so I will now also be your servant, then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. And do you not have Zadok and Abiathar the priests with you there? Therefore it will be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you will tell to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Indeed, they have there their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, Jonathan, Abiathar's son, and by them you shall send me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. Chapter 17, please, and verse 15. Now Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, thus and so Ahithophel advised Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so I have advised. Now therefore send quickly and tell David, do not spend this night in the plains in the wilderness, and speedily cross over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up. Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz stayed at Enrogel, for they dared not to be seen coming into the city. So a female servant would come and tell them, and they would go and tell David. Nevertheless, a lad saw them and told Absalom. But both of them went quickly, came to a man's house in Bahurim, who had a well in his court, and they went down into it. Then the woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and spread ground grain on it, and the thing was not known. And when Absalom's servants came to the women of the house, they said, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? So the woman said to them, they've gone over the water brook. And when they searched and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. It came to pass, after they departed, that they came up out of the well and went and told King David and said to David, arise, cross over the water quickly, for thus has Ahithophel advised against you. So David and all the people who were with him arose and crossed over the Jordan. By morning light, not one of them was left who had not gone over the Jordan. And lastly, in chapter 18, please, verse 19, then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies. Joab said to him, you shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead. Joab said to the Cushite, go tell the king what you've seen. So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. And Ahimaaz the son of Zadok said again to Joab, but whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready?" "Whatever happens," he said, "let me run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate, to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. And the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "There is another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." And then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man." There's three scenes there, and I just want to comment briefly on each of them. The first is as David's going out over the brook Kidron, going into the wilderness. And the second is this taking of the news to him by the two runners. And the third is after the battle and Absalom's dead, and the news is brought back to David about the victory. They're the three scenes. So very briefly, the first one of them concerns Zadok and Abiathar and the Levites bringing the Ark of the Covenant out of Jerusalem and David's response to that. I don't want to sound before you tonight too critical of Zadok and Abiathar, because I think they had the right motivation. I think their roots were in the right place, just that the fruit was a bit wonky and they got it wrong. And David put right what was wrong in their thinking. David's theology here is correct. The Ark of the Covenant had to do with God's presence among his people. And that was on the basis of a covenant, the covenant that he'd made with them at Sinai. And it was on the basis of a law and their obedience. It was a conditional covenant. It was conditional on their obedience to the law that he also gave them at Sinai. So there was never any excuse for using the Ark of the Covenant like a lucky charm. You didn't wheel this thing out to battle and flash it in front of your enemies to dazzle them and therefore bring God into your military strategy and so on, as if he would tick your boxes. That was not the thing. Israel had failed in that already. You remember in the early part of 1 Samuel, they'd done exactly that. So what one commentator commented on that incident said it was rabbit foot theology. And that's about all it was. Treating the Ark of God like a lucky charm. And David would have nothing to do with that. So he says that it was to be taken back. His thinking here is absolutely clear. David's thinking is crystal clear. He sees himself as being in the hand of God, not God in his hand. What we've got here is not, with David's speech to Zadok and Abiathar, it's not weak resignation. This is not, "Oh, woe is me, poor is me." He knows that he's in the hand of God and God will sovereignly do with him what he will do. And he knows there's promises that God's made of him. He also is aware of his sin and his failure. And he's saying, I'm in the hand of God. It's not weak resignation. It's robust submission. That's what we find here in David's attitude. It's faith that's shining brightly in a very dark hour. And there's no sense of David using God. It's David submitting himself to God. I don't know any greater demonstration of that. In fact, I'll say emphatically, there can be no greater demonstration than what we're speaking about than what is seen in Gethsemane. And that's the Lord, of course. And in the agony of what he was to face at Calvary on the cross, and sensing that agony in the garden that had such a physical effect upon him that his perspiration became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. He cried out from that agony, "Not my will, yours be done." That's total submission, no matter what the cost. The immediate cost is total submission and faith expressed by the Son of God in the whole counsel of God. And I mean by that the Godhead that had counseled what would happen at Calvary. The Lord Jesus submitted himself to the execution of that, despite what it cost him on the cross. That's the greatest expression of what it is that we're pointing to here. So when you and I find ourselves submitting to God, as David did on this occasion, it's a pale reflection of that, of course, the sinlessness of Christ. But we come with our recognition of our failure, and we want to submit. I think when we do that, we can stand back and see what God will do with such submission, because God works with that. There's a great verse in Habakkuk's little 3-chapter book, and in the beginning of the 2nd chapter, Habakkuk, having brought his complaint to God, says this. He says, I will stand my watch. I will set myself upon the rampart, and I will watch and see what he will do, and what I will answer him after he has corrected me. See that? That's submission to the hand of God, and it's what we see here in David. Just as a second part to this first scene that I just want to mention to you, because having given that sound bit of theology to Zadok and Abiathar, and I believe it was utterly sound, he then goes on to set up his 5th column in Jerusalem. There's his friend Hushai, there's Zadok and Abiathar, whom he's sending back. There's their 2 sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan. And David is strategizing. He's putting the thing in place. And I want to say to you that those verses that describe it, 27 and 28, are in no way contradictory to the verses that precede them concerning his submission, 25 and 26. The two things are utterly complementary. When we give complete submission to God, we're still expected to use our head. People talk about blind faith. I think there's no such thing as blind faith. I don't want to get off subject here, but the faith of Moses is described as seeing him who is invisible. There is a certain sight attached with it, but there's also this thinking, this rationale, and nowhere are we told to park it in neutral. Both things go hand in hand. So there's no contradiction. This is David with wise strategy, putting things in place. But notice it's without idolatry. Had he brought the ark, had he accepted what the Levites were doing, that would have been idolatry, placing something in a piece of furniture when it's really the fellowship with God that was the essential thing. It's what that represented, of course. But David would have nothing to do with that. So it's to go back to its place. And I am in the hand of God. It's submission, but in submission, he's acting sensibly. I'm sure I've quoted this to you before, because I quote it all over the place. I once made I was going to say unpardonable error of quoting it in Southern Ireland. You don't quote Oliver Cromwell in Southern Ireland, at least not without expecting some kickback. But I did it once, inadvertently. And I'll tell you that story another time. Anyway, Oliver Cromwell said a lot of things, wise things, but he famously said, trust God and keep your powder dry. Did I mention that to you earlier on? Maybe one of the first time we were speaking about Amram and Jochebed waterproofing the little ark of bulrushes. You see, that's common sense. Can you imagine these two faithful parents making this little, what are you doing, Amram, Jochebed? Or we're making this little boat to put our baby and we're going to float him out in the Nile. Well, that's going to leak. It's going to, you better make it waterproof. No, we trust in God. You see the ridiculousness of it? You trust God and keep your powder dry. Trust God and put waterproofing on your little ark of bulrushes or whatever it is. Use your head. God doesn't expect it any other way. That little maxim that some of us grew up with, let go and let God, is not so theologically sound as perhaps we once thought it was. When you let God do things, God expects you to do your part also. He brings us in to the fulfillment of his purposes, the unfolding of his ways. And that's our faith, our part of faithful service for him. So that's the first scene. I just want to move on because you will see how these are connected. The second one is the actual outworking of that. So now Absalom's come back into Jerusalem. Hushai has finagled himself into the council rooms of Absalom and got himself listening into Ahithophel's advice. And he gives his own advice. There's a lot, we haven't read all the detail there, but I guess you know it. And then, of course, he takes this out to Zadok and Abiathar, and they send a message out to their sons, and Jonathan and Ahimaaz are set to run with the message to David. So what David has put in place is actually outworking here in the second scene. And this is where we find our now familiar theme of Exodus and 2 Kings, Obadiah. And the thing I want to say to you once again is, I hope you don't think I'm just harping on one string here, but the thing I want to point out to you again, brothers and sisters, is this, that it appears so fragile a thing, doesn't it? You think, for example, of Hushai to begin with. Hushai is in a precarious position here. Absalom's already looked on him with suspicion. And he's in a very precarious, vulnerable position. Good old Hushai stands his ground, and he's very wise. And I know we can take issue with telling porcupines and that, but I'm not dumbing that down, by the way. Truth is an important thing. But the scriptures don't comment on that. What we're seeing through this is the overarching, overworking hand of God. And he's doing it through some also rans. Some people who may appear to be inconsequential, but were far from it in their dealings. So Hushai, his precarious position is one thing. No, but the two runners, Jonathan and Ahimaaz. And they're seen by a lad, and Absalom sends his soldiers out after them. And they're climbing down a well, and a woman comes and puts the covering on and puts some grain on top of that to dry in the sun to cover them up. And it all looks so vulnerable, so fragile. Does God really carry out the ways of God with those kind of methods? And you know the answer to that, don't you? It's a resounding yes. It's the way God does things. And I just love that about the revelation of God in the Word of God. So many times he's working in that way. Last week we were in First Kings, and in that little story about Obadiah the obscure, there's two incidents either side of it. And those two incidents are very, very different in character. One is Elijah being fed, and the other is Elijah on Mount Carmel. Elijah being fed, he's fed by ravens, and he gets his drink from a little brook. Well, that's no big shakes, is it? This is no Riven Rock at Rephidim. This is a little brook that eventually dries up, and it's ravens bringing him food. And when that all finishes, God sends him to a widow who's just got just enough flour and oil for one meal. You see, it's also fragile, also vulnerable to failure, or is it? And that's the picture, one side of the Obadiah story. And then you come to Carmel, the other side, and you've got all that water being dumped on the sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the trench around it being filled. And Elijah prays, and the fire of God comes down, and it burns up the bull, and it burns up the wood, and it burns up the stones, and it burns up the dust, and it licks up all the water. That's phenomenal. And that's the power that we so often associate with the ways of God. And we expect that because God is God. But God tells us so plainly in his word, I don't always work that way. You remember after that incident, he called Elijah down to Horeb, that's Sinai, standing at the doorway of a cave, opening of a cave, there was a great wind so strong that it broke rocks in pieces. He says God wasn't in the wind. And then after the wind, an earthquake. He says God wasn't in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, and God was not in that fire. And after the fire, the sound of gentle stillness. God was there. See, God doesn't always work in those supernatural, powerful, of course he can do. He has done, he will do. But so often, through all the ages, he's working through ordinary people like you and me in very ordinary ways. And that's what we've seen and are continuing to see. No such thing as an also ran. We're running in the purposes of God. And there are consequences in that, though they may appear on the face of it to be quite small things. Just before we leave this point, let me just show you something in regards to David's prayer concerning Ahithophel. When he hears of Ahithophel, that means Absalom's got the chief man, the greatest advisor, counselor there is around in the whole kingdom. So David immediately prays, Lord, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Let me ask you something. Did God answer that prayer? Well, the answer is yes, he did, but not in the way that David prayed it. He didn't turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Ahithophel gave very cunning, that is, wise in the ways of men, very cunning advice. What God did was he turned Absalom's into foolishness in rejecting Ahithophel's advice. So you see how God answers our prayer, but not in accordance with the prescription that we often put on those prayers. We must never presume that God answers prayers in the way that we ask them. Pray anyway and trust him and do your part. Now, very quickly, we come to this last and final reading in chapter 18. The battle is over. You know what's happened. Absalom has gone riding on his mule through the forest. His hair that he was so proud of is caught in the boughs of the string, yanks him off the mule, and he's left hanging there. Man sees him, runs and gets Joab. Joab comes, and he puts 3 darts, 3 spears through the heart of Absalom. I have to wonder about Joab. Would one not have done? And then, of course, they cut down the corpse and they throw it into a pit and they pile stones over it. The whole thing is so sickening. There's a sickening air about that whole incident, isn't there? Makes us wonder. But in the back of our minds, we hear David's plaintive cry of a father. Deal gently with my son, Absalom. And then his cry afterwards. Anyway, we have to leave all that because that's not for tonight. That's the scene. And in all that scene, Joab says, now we'll send a messenger to David to tell him the victory, and he gets the Cushite to run. And Ahimaaz is there, and he's in Joab's face, isn't he? Let me run, let me run. He was no small child, Ahimaaz, but you see this kind of thing at school all the time, don't you? Let me do it, me, sir. And Ahimaaz is just desperate to run. And I think he gets on Joab's nerves so much that Joab says, oh, for goodness sake, run. And the Cushite's already well on his way, of course. So Ahimaaz runs, and you know the story. I suppose you've heard it too. We've heard a lesson lifted out of this incident that teaches us about the importance of having an account with the man of Calvary, that we must come to our own realization of what happened on the cross. And of course, that's true. It's very true. I'm just doubtful as to whether we should be taking that out of this narrative, because I don't think that's what the narrative teaches us. It's based on Joab's word to the Cushite, go and tell him what you have seen. And we've been told many times that the implication of that is that Ahimaaz had not seen what the Cushite saw, not seen the man in the tree and so on. But probably, like me, you feel uncomfortable with taking this scene and aligning it in any sense at all with Calvary. But that apart, I don't think the text actually allows us to do that, does it? Because Ahimaaz did know what had happened. I think he was just very, very reticent in telling that part to David, because he knew what David had said to Joab. about dealing gently with him. So the two men are running, but they're not running together. Note that. Jonathan and Ahimaaz had run together. And when men run together, they're running at risk, because if one is ambushed, or they're both ambushed, one might escape and still get the message through. These were single runners because it was the hour of victory. These are men with the message of good news. And David knew that when it was relayed to him. Single runner, they're bringing news. So Ahimaaz comes in. And this is just the simple point I want to leave with you finally tonight from these narratives. Without pushing anything more into it. Ahimaaz had part of the story, and he was willing. I say he was willing because I don't believe it. I know it was the command of the king, but Ahimaaz was willing to stand aside and let another man come and complete the story. You know, when we're running in the purposes of God, when we're involved in the service of the Most High God, we must always be prepared for someone having a part of that, another person, maybe many people having a part of that. I don't blame Ahimaaz for being desperate to run that day. He'd been in this thing from the beginning, running with Jonathan, his friend, down and taking the messages. I believe he'd been in the main course as well as the hors d'oeuvre. He'd been in the main course of the battle, because otherwise why would he have been there? We don't know what he did, but I think it's fair to assume he was in that. Now comes the dessert. Here's the sweetness of victory. And Ahimaaz wants to have a part in that too. Who would blame him? So with full understanding, we understand why Ahimaaz was so desperate to run with the message that day. But you know, there are some people I've met who want to be the beginning, the middle, and the end of everything. And that's not the way of disciples of Christ. We run with others, and others are running and doing their part, and there will be a time to step aside and let them do their part. We're not to be the bearers of every bit of news. It doesn't matter if people think we don't know it. There've been many gospel preachers that have accused Ahimaaz of that down the years, and I don't think it matters. I don't think Ahimaaz would worry about that a jot. And don't let it worry you if people think that about you. Oh, she doesn't know, he doesn't know that. Well, that's okay, even if you did. Let it be. We're all running in our part. Let me finish with this final contemplation of where we're up to at the moment. There's no way that Absalom could have won in this. There's no way in which the advice of Ahithophel could have brought down David. Why? Because God, the Lord God Jehovah, had spoken to David certain things concerning his kingdom. And there was no way that long-haired popularism or very clever advice and counsel could ever undo what God had said. So that if the ways of God are so certain, and he uses Ahimaaz's and Jonathan's and unnamed Cushites to complete the story, their part in it is not as an also-ran. They're not two-bit players, however the world views us. My brother and sister, you're not, nor ever could be. If you're involved in the work of God in any part at all, it's part of a link, of a chain linked with others and others and others in this full thing. And God looks at it and sees it as a matter of very great consequence and value.